It was a humid evening in the 1960s, deep in the dense, oppressive jungle of Vietnam. The air thickened with the smell of damp earth, and the rhythmic hum of insects blended with the distant crackle of radio chatter. The soldiers of Bravo Company had been patrolling this treacherous terrain for weeks. They were exhausted, physically drained, mentally frayed and jumpy. The military had recently issued a new piece of technology to help the soldiers in their endless surveillance of the jungle: experimental night vision goggles. These early models weren't like the sleek modern versions of today. They were bulky, heavy, with lenses that distorted the world into a grainy, eerie glow. The idea was simple: amplify ambient light to see in the dark. But the reality was far more unsettling. The first night they used them, Sergeant Daniels had been one of the first to volunteer. His mission was a reconnaissance patrol in the dense forest, a task that usually felt like walking blind. The goggles, once strapped over his eyes, altered his perception. He could see beyond the range of a normal flashlight, detecting the faintest glimmers of moonlight filtering through the canopy. But there was something wrong. The jungle looked different. The shadows, which had once been predictable, now stretched unnaturally. They twisted demon-like and distorted dark tendrils reaching from the ground. At first, Daniels thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, a result of sleep deprivation or the strangeness of the goggles. Then he saw them, figures moving between the trees, tall, thin, and too quick for human soldiers. They seemed to glide, almost as if they were floating above the ground. Their features were indistinct, but their shapes were unmistakable. Tall, elongated arms swung from their sides, and their heads were too large. For a moment, Daniels thought he was seeing ghosts. "Sergeant Daniels, you good?" A voice crackled in his earpiece. It was Private Taylor, just behind him in the patrol. Daniels blinked hard, shaking his head. "I'm fine, Taylor. Just keep your eyes peeled." But the entities were everywhere now. They moved among the soldiers like phantoms. Some even appeared to whisper into their ears. Cloaked figures walking in and out of the shadows, never fully visible, always just out of reach. There were dozens, maybe more. The trees groaned under their weight as they passed, their movements causing the leaves to rustle. But when the soldiers turned to look, there was nothing there. The night vision goggles distorted everything, making it impossible to distinguish between shadow and substance. "Do you see that?" Private Sanchez whispered, his voice trembling. He was looking into the dense growth, his eyes wide. There, in the trees. Daniels spun to where Sanchez was pointing. A figure moved among the branches, but as soon as he focused on it, it was gone. The sound of footsteps seemed to come from all directions at once. Quick, erratic. Soldiers began to pull at their helmets, adjusting their goggles in panic, but it made no difference. The figures only grew more unsettling, more numerous. One by one, the soldiers began to speak up. They weren't sure what they were seeing, but they knew something was wrong. The night vision amplified everything: the sounds, the sights, even the feeling of eyes on them from all directions. It was a nightmare made real, a constant feeling of being watched, of being hunted. Then it escalated. One of the soldiers, Private Jenkins, screamed. A thick, unnatural growl had echoed out of the darkness. Something was too close. Something had touched him. Daniels turned to see Jenkins, his face pale, his mouth agape in terror, his eyes wide and bloodshot, as though the night had driven him mad. "Something's out there," Jenkins yelled, shaking uncontrollably. "They're real. I saw them." He collapsed to the ground, trembling. The rest of the patrol scattered into the trees, running blindly in all directions. Panic set in like a fever. Some tried to rally together, but the fear was too contagious. They couldn't see what was chasing them, but they felt it. Close, too close. As the hours stretched on, the soldiers began to hear more things. Whispers in the night, the rustling of leaves, as if something walked just beyond their vision. Some of them swore they felt cold hands graze their backs, or hear heavy breathing from behind them. "Get them off me," yelled Corporal Miller. He was swinging wildly, his rifle aimed at a shadow just out of reach. But nothing was there. There was no one to shoot. The panic grew, the fear becoming something tangible, like a force of its own, pulling them deeper into madness. Eventually, the dawn came. The entities vanished with the first light, as though they had never been there at all. The soldiers were exhausted, disoriented, and deeply shaken. Many of them, eyes wide and hollow, were unsure whether the horrors they had witnessed were real or just the effect of the goggles. Some were never the same after that night. Weeks later, Bravo Company was back in base, and word had spread. Some soldiers whispered about what they had seen, shadowy figures, demons of the jungle, but official reports from the military dismissed the claims as nothing more than the result of fatigue and malfunctioning equipment. But Daniels and his men knew what they had experienced. They had seen things in the night that no one else could understand. And the worst part? They never quite figured out if it was the goggles playing tricks or if something truly walked among them in the darkness. Something that thrived in the unseen corners of the world, waiting for the night to fall once more. And they knew deep down that the shadows were still there, waiting for nightfall